As V4 was nearing completion in May of 1927, the U.S. began another batch of the V-class. Again, these were designed by the Navy and built in Navy yards. Like all the Vs, they were originally designated SF or Submarine Fleet. However, with the obvious failure of the Fleet submarine idea, they were redesignated SC or Cruiser Submarine. The two boats of the V5 class were smaller than the previous V4, but not by much, at 2,700 tons surfaced and 3,900 submerged tons. So big were they that under the terms of the 1930 London Treaty, these brand new boats and Argonaut should have been scrapped as being too large. It was only a specific exception clause that saved them. Again, their size was dictated by their role. As a cruiser submarine, their role was long-range raider. This meant long patrols operating far from port, and as such, range, habitability, and weapons load took precedent over speed. Just take a look at how high Narwhal rides in the water and the width of her deck. This also marked a return to the concept of an attack boat. Again, remember that at this time, subs spent most of their time on the surface, and most attacks during World War I had been carried out with deck guns. To facilitate this, as with Argonaut, these boats were fitted with 6-inch deck guns, the same guns used on the Omaha-class light cruiser a decade earlier, except in single open mounts. They were also the first U.S. subs to be totally double-hulled. Additionally, by World War II, they carried the new Mark 14 torpedo. On the downside, they carried the Mark 14 torpedo. Also, like Argonaut, their large size made them slow to dive, easy to detect, and hard to maneuver. Finally, like their predecessors, they initially had unreliable engines that constantly had to be repaired. Still, in retrospect, I consider them a success, serving with distinction. Like Argonaut, both were re-engined and modified as commando transports early in the war as newer, more capable attack subs entered service. Along with Argonaut, due to their conversion and long endurance, they would continue to see frontline duty even after the other Vs were relegated to training. Finally, at the start of 1945, with dozens of new subs in service and more on the way, these old boats were decommissioned. V5 was started May 10th of 1927 and commissioned May 15th, 1930. V6 was started August 2nd of 1927 and commissioned July 1st of 1930. Main armament was initially 4 forward and 2 aft 21-inch torpedo tubes for 24 torpedoes. 2 6-inch 53 caliber deck guns were fitted, 1 forward and 1 aft of the sail. Initially, machinery was 2 diesel engines that provided 4,700 horsepower. Additionally, they had a separate pair of diesels generating 900 horsepower for recharging the batteries, which could boost the main engines for a surface speed of 17 knots. While submerged, they used their batteries to power a pair of electric motors that provided 1,600 horsepower for a submerged speed of 8 knots. Maximum diving depth was again 300 feet. Like their near sister Argonaut, both were heavily modified. In February of 1931, V5 was renamed Narwhal and V6 was renamed Nautilus. In 1939, Nautilus was fitted with tanks for 19,320 gallons of aviation gas to refuel pontoon-equipped scout planes. Between July of 1941 and February of 1942, Nautilus underwent conversion and modernization. These involved replacing her unreliable engines with new ones, adding air conditioning, fitting 2 forward and 2 aft external torpedo tubes tucked into her deck, improving electronics, adding a TDC, and adding room for raiding parties. Between September of 1942 and April of 1943, Narwhal was modified to a commando-carrying sub. To add room for raiders, her torpedoes were removed, and her old engines that worked in a direct drive manner were replaced with new ones that operated in the now standard electric drive manner. Narwhal was at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, but escaped damage. In February of 1942, she sailed to the East China Sea, taking a look at the recently fallen island of Wake along the way. Returning in May, she redeployed to Midway to take part in the battle there, but returned in mid-June empty-handed. In July of 1942, this cruiser sub sailed to the Kurils, where she sunk several ships before returning in late August of 1942. Following the above-mentioned conversion that kept her at the West Coast from September of 1942 until April of 1943, she headed to Alaska, where she joined Nautilus in landing raiders on Attu in preparation for the liberation of that island. Next, she sailed back to the Kurils and operated there from mid-July to early August of 1943. From late August to late September of 1943, she patrolled the Marshall Islands. Finally, operating out of Australia and New Guinea, she spent late October of 1943 through the end of 1944 landing raiding parties and their supplies throughout the Philippine Islands, first in preparation for and then in support of the U.S.'s liberation of those islands. With the war wrapping up in early January of 1945, she returned to the East Coast and was decommissioned. Nautilus was at the West Coast undergoing conversion when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, a conversion that would keep her out of the war until mid-April of 1942. As such, her first patrol was the Battle of Midway, where she played an important if unexpected role. The destroyer Enterprise's dive bombers, followed back to the Japanese carriers, was returning to the fleet after unsuccessfully counterattacking Nautilus. Next, she joined with Argonaut to deliver the Marines that raided the enemy-held Makin Island on August 8th of 1942. After replenishment, she operated in the Kurils from mid-September to late October of 1942 to attack Japanese merchant ships. In mid-December of 1942, she began operating the Solomons until mid-April of 1943. With the U.S. going on the offensive in the Aleutians, she embarked several Pathfinder raiders and landed them May 11, 1943, to kick off the liberation of Attu. Long overdue for an overhaul, she sat out most of the summer of 1943 before returning to do pre-invasion reconnaissance of the Gilberts in the fourth quarter of 1943. The first quarter of 1944 found her operating in the Philippine Sea in preparation of the invasion of the Marianas. From May of 1944 to the end of the year, she operated around the Philippines, both attacking enemy ships and landing raiders and their supplies, as the U.S. first prepared to and then invaded the Philippines to liberate them from the Japanese. Having finished her last patrol at the end of January 1945, she sailed to the East Coast and was decommissioned. One important thing of note is the fitting of air conditioning. As anybody that has owned a boat with a cabin will tell you, cabins have a tendency to get hot. On the open sea, there is little or no shade, and the below decks have a tendency to turn into an oven. This is especially true of a ship or sub made of metal. Yes, submarines go underwater, but again, you have to remember, subs of this era spent most of their time on the surface. With only a few openings for ventilation, you can imagine what life would be like for a submarine's crew operating in the tropics. It would be easy to simply say, gut it out to anyone that complains, but it isn't that simple. As the 20s turned into the 30s and the 30s turned into the 40s, the amount of electronics on a sub spiraled upward. Humans deal with the heat by drinking more water and then not re-enlisting. Electronics and machines then, just as now, deal with heat by breaking down and not working. Thus, it became imperative, not just for the comfort and well-being of the crew, but to the ability of a sub to operate as a fighting machine, that air conditioning was fitted or refitted.